As I mentioned at the beginning of Mass this evening Mass brings to a conclusion the year of youth. And it was for that reason that I asked that the Gospel story of the journey of the two disciples to Emmaus might be read before we began our liturgy this evening. The Gospel we've just listened to is a particularly good Gospel for the launch of LifeLink. And I'm sure as you listen to the video, you'll see why. But I wanted the Emmaus story also to be in our minds tonight. So let me explain why. At the conclusion of the recent synod on young people, the faith and vocational discernment, which Pope Francis called recently in Rome, and to which some of our Australian bishops went, I was fascinated to discover that the bishops decided to structure the final document of the synod on this story of the encounter between the risen Jesus and his two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Those two disciples were fleeing from Jerusalem in fear and deep disillusionment after the cruel death of Jesus on the cross. Their hearts were heavy as they carried the bitter burden of horror, of shame, and really of the destruction of all their hopes in Jesus. His agonising death seemed to them to destroy any hope that Jesus might really have been all that he said he was. Imagine their joy then, as Jesus walked with them and they came to realise that he was indeed risen, that he really was the divine Son of God. And that's why I wanted us to listen to the story of Emmaus just before Mass began this evening, because I wanted to link tonight's Mass with the Synod of Bishops for Young People. That synod was held for so many people like so many of you here in the cathedral tonight. And it's good for us to feel ourselves connected with the wider church and especially with the bishops gathered in Rome around the Holy Father. In choosing that Emmaus story, the bishops identified three key ideas which I want to propose to you this evening as a way of understanding what our Catholic faith, and within it, the role of those of you who will be commissioned as youth ambassadors, and also the role of all of the young people here in the cathedral tonight, what being a Catholic is really all about. The three ideas or themes that the bishop chose are these. Firstly, Jesus walked with the disciples. The second idea is that their eyes were opened. And the third idea is that they then set out without delay. He walked with them. Their eyes were opened. And they set out without delay. As I reflected on these three ideas, I couldn't help noticing how much they tied in with my own episcopal motto, which you can see there above the bishop's chair. It's made up of three Latin words: via, veritas, and vita. They're the words that Jesus uses to describe himself in the Gospel of St. John when he says to his disciples, "I am the way," the via. "I am the truth," the veritas. And "I am the life," the vita. When the bishops at the Synod nominated as their first key idea the fact that Jesus walked with his disciples, they were really trying to point us to the truth that Jesus is the way. It's true that in the Emmaus story, Jesus walked with his disciples as they were actually running away from Jerusalem. But the purpose of his walking with them was to eventually lead them to the realisation that they had to turn around. They had to take a different way. Not their way, but his way. He encountered them where they were and as they were, frightened and disappointed and confused, but he didn't leave them where they were. On the contrary, as the Gospel tells us, by the end of the story, when they rush back to Jerusalem, they talk about the way their hearts were burning within them as Jesus talked to them on the journey. Fear had been replaced by courage. Despair had been replaced by hope. Doubt had been replaced by certainty. And why? Because they let Jesus walk with them and they let him show them a better path to follow. Jesus is our way. The bishops then remind us that in this encounter with Jesus, the eyes of the disciples were opened. Running away from Jerusalem, the two disciples were utterly convinced that everything was over. All hope was lost. They had been deceived. But because they encountered Jesus and because they were prepared to listen to him, they were led to a truth which was the exact opposite of what they had come to believe. There must have been something about the way Jesus spoke to them and what Jesus said to them that opened their eyes and their hearts. But there also must have been something about the disciples themselves which enabled them to truly listen to Jesus. Deep within them, there must have been a search for the truth, which was so insistent that when finally the truth was proclaimed to them, they recognised it for what it was. And this is always what a true encounter with Jesus does for us. It touches that deep desire for the truth that lies within us, and it sets us free to recognise that truth and then to want to live by it. Jesus is that truth. The bishops then, in their third point, recall that after all this happened, the two disciples left without delay. They set out immediately. And in fact, what they did was return as quickly as they could to Jerusalem. They had run away from what they had experienced as a place of death. But now, having encountered Jesus, having listened to him and having believed him, they set out for the same place, but knowing that it is in fact not the place of death, but the place of life. And two things in particular strike me as I think about this. The first is that whenever we have a real encounter with Jesus, it is life-changing. We can't stay the same. We can't stay locked into our own preconceptions. We can't stay imprisoned by our own fears or defeated by our own sense of hopelessness. We have to change. We have to let ourselves be challenged and unsettled. Take the risk of trusting Jesus, taking him at his word, and then rush forward into the life he has designed for us. Because Jesus is our life. Many of you have heard me say often that unless Jesus is absolutely at the heart of everything we do in our lives as Catholics, young or old, then we have missed the whole meaning of our faith. There are teachings of the Church to be believed, and there are moral and ethical commandments to follow, but they will only appear to us in all their glory and all their wisdom, and will only have the power to convince us and claim our commitment if we see them as given to us by the one who is the only way for us to follow, the only truth to which we can confidently commit ourselves, and the only life that can bring us fully and forever alive. Christianity without Christ is dead. Without Christ, the Church crumbles and falls. When St. John Paul II was elected Pope, at the homily he gave at the Mass of Inauguration, he made an impassioned plea that I wanted also to make to all of you tonight as we bring the Year of Youth to a close, as we commission our parish youth ambassadors, and also as we turn our gaze to the Australian Catholic Youth Festival, which we will host here in Perth this time next year. So let me leave you with the words of St. John Paul II, and may those words ring in your hearts as we continue to celebrate the Mass. Do not be afraid. Throw open the doors of your hearts to Christ.